My daughter Jessica called me a useless burden at Thanksgiving dinner in front of 14 family members, and when I looked around the table for support, every single person avoided my eyes. Not my son Michael, not his wife Caroline, not even my grandchildren who used to fight over who got to sit next to Grandma Rose. That night, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything forever. Within 4 months, they were all frantically searching for me while I was living my best life, in a place they'd never think to look, with more money than I'd ever told them I had. Now Jessica's begging me to come back, but she has no idea I've been watching from a distance, and what I've discovered about my family has made me realize I was never the burden. They were. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, have you ever felt like your family saw you as an inconvenience rather than a blessing? Share your story below. My name is Rose Whitman, and for the past 15 years since my husband Frank passed away, I'd been the family's unofficial caretaker, babysitter, house sitter, and emergency contact for everything that went wrong in anyone's life. When Jessica's marriage fell apart 3 years ago, who took care of her twin boys every weekend while she found herself at expensive therapy retreats and weekend getaways with her book club friends? When Michael's construction business hit rough patches during the 2020 recession, who quietly helped with his mortgage payments for 8 months without ever asking for credit or recognition? When Caroline needed someone to watch their house during their 2-week European vacation, or when any of the grandchildren needed rides to school because parents were too busy with work meetings, or when family emergencies required someone reliable and available 24/7, it was always Grandma Rose to the rescue. I'd raised Jessica and Michael as a single mother after their father died in Vietnam when they were just 8 and 6 years old. Frank and I had only been married 2 years when he was deployed in 1972, and I spent the next 48 years believing that his sacrifice meant I owed it to his memory to be everything our children needed. I worked as a school secretary at Riverside Falls Elementary for 35 years, starting when Jessica entered kindergarten and continuing until I was 65, saving every penny I could and building what I thought was a close, loving family where everyone looked out for each other. But let me tell you the full story of how I became the family's go-to person, because understanding that journey is crucial to understanding how devastating it was when they turned on me. After Frank died, I was 22 years old with 2 small children, no college degree, and a widow's pension that barely covered rent on our tiny apartment above Morrison's grocery store on Main Street. The apartment had thin walls, a heater that worked sporadically, and a kitchen so small I could touch both walls with my arms outstretched. But it was what I could afford, and I was determined to make it work. I took the job at the elementary school because the hours meant I could be home when Jessica and Michael got off the bus, and summer breaks meant I could spend those precious months focused entirely on them. The pay was modest. I started at $8,000 a year in 1973, which sounds ridiculous now, but was barely enough to survive even then. I wore the same 3 dresses to work for 2 years, alternating them throughout the week and washing them by hand every evening, because our building's laundry machines were broken more often than they worked. Those early years were a masterclass in creative poverty management. I became an expert at making hamburgers stretch across 4 meals, turning leftover chicken into soup that would last 3 days, and finding ways to make Christmas magical with presents that cost less than $5 each. I learned to cut Jessica and Michael's hair myself, hem their clothes when they grew, and patch knees in pants until the patches had patches, but I never let them feel poor. That was my mission, my obsession, my way of honoring Frank's memory. I volunteered for every school activity, attended every parent conference, and made sure my children had the kind of engaged, present mother that other kids envied. When Jessica wanted to take piano lessons, I found a retired teacher who would accept payment in homemade bread and garden vegetables. When Michael showed interest in baseball, I worked extra hours typing documents for local businesses to afford his equipment and league fees. I taught them to value education, hard work, and family loyalty. I read to them every night, helped with homework at our tiny kitchen table, and created traditions that made our modest life feel rich and meaningful. Sunday pancake breakfasts with real maple syrup, my one weekly splurge. Saturday afternoon, walks through Riverside Park where we'd feed ducks and make up stories about the families living in the big houses overlooking the lake. Christmas Eve candlelight services at St. Mark's Methodist Church, followed by hot chocolate and one special present opened before bed. As Jessica and Michael grew older and more successful, I felt pride that sometimes brought tears to my eyes. Jessica earned a scholarship to State University and graduated with a degree in marketing. Michael learned construction from his best friend's father and eventually started his own contracting business. They both married good people, bought houses in the nice part of town, and gave me 6 beautiful grandchildren who became the light of my life. My small house on Maple Avenue, which I'd finally been able to buy when the kids were in high school, became the family gathering place for every holiday, birthday, and celebration. I was the one who remembered everyone's favorite foods, who kept photo albums and scrapbooks documenting every milestone, who organized family reunions and made sure the traditions we'd created during those lean early years continued even as everyone's circumstances improved. When Jessica's first son, Tommy, was born, I was the one who showed up at the hospital at 3 a.m. and stayed for a week, cooking meals, doing laundry, and helping with night feedings so Jessica could recover. When Michael and Caroline's daughter, Emma, had colic, I spent 3 months going to their house every evening to walk the floor with her while they got a few hours of sleep. When any of the grandchildren needed babysitting, I rearranged my schedule. When they had school plays, I was in the front row. When they needed help with homework, they called Grandma Rose. As the years passed, my role evolved from crisis management to everyday support system. I became the family's logistics coordinator, emergency fund, and emotional backbone. Need someone to pick up kids from school? Call Rose. Need a casserole for a potluck? Rose will make her famous tuna noodle dish. Need someone to house sit during vacation? Rose has nothing else to do. Need extra money for car repairs or unexpected medical bills? Rose has been saving her Social Security checks and can help out. I didn't mind any of it. In fact, I cherished my role as the family matriarch. Being needed gave my life purpose and meaning. Watching my children and grandchildren thrive felt like the ultimate validation of all those years of struggle and sacrifice. When Jessica got promoted to marketing director at the regional hospital, when Michael won the contract to build the new community center, when the grandchildren made honor roll or starred in school plays, I felt like I'd contributed to their success through decades of unwavering support and love. But somewhere in the last few years, something fundamental had shifted. The gratitude had faded into expectation. The appreciation had transformed into assumption. My helpfulness had become so routine that it was invisible, taken for granted like electricity or running water, only noticed when it was missing. The signs had been building for months, though I'd been too busy being useful to pay attention. Conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Family plans discussed in group text chains that somehow never included me. Grandchildren who used to call me regularly just to chat now only contacted me when they needed rides or wanted me to slip them $20 for movies. Holiday invitations started coming with subtle modifications. Mom, you don't need to go to all the trouble of cooking your green bean casserole this year. We're simplifying the menu. Rose, maybe you could bring store-bought rolls instead of making your homemade ones. We're trying to cut down on the work. Grandma, you don't have to come to my soccer game if the weather's bad. I know driving at night is hard for you. Each suggestion was framed as consideration for my age and convenience, but the underlying message was clear. Your contributions are no longer essential. Your presence is no longer required. Your role in this family is shrinking. The most painful part was watching my grandchildren, who had once competed for my attention and affection, gradually become polite but distant. Tommy, now 16, was too busy with his part-time job and girlfriend to visit. Emma, 14, spent our time together scrolling through social media and responding to my questions with one-word answers. The younger ones still showed affection, but even they seemed to view me as a convenient source of snacks and spending, money rather than someone whose company they genuinely enjoyed. I told myself it was natural evolution. Families grow and change, children become independent, grandchildren develop their own interests and social circles. I told myself that feeling increasingly irrelevant was just the normal experience of aging, something every grandmother probably felt as the generations shifted and she became less central to daily family life. But the truth was harder to accept. The family I'd spent 50 years building and supporting had started seeing me as an obligation rather than an asset, a burden rather than a blessing, someone to be managed and placated rather than celebrated and cherished. The evidence was everywhere once I started paying attention. When Jessica planned her book club meetings, she scheduled them at my house without asking, assuming I'd be happy to host and clean up afterward. When Michael needed storage space for construction equipment, he asked to use my garage as if my convenience didn't matter. When family photos were taken at gatherings, I was often positioned on the edges or asked to take this one so I wouldn't be in the picture. Most painfully, I realized that my children had begun talking about me as if I were already gone. When Mom's not around anymore, we'll need to figure out who's going to handle the holiday hosting. Rose won't be able to help with babysitting forever. We should probably start thinking about what to do with Mom's house eventually. These conversations weren't malicious, but they revealed how my family had started viewing me as a temporary convenience rather than a permanent part of their lives. They were already planning for my absence, already dividing up the roles I'd played, already imagining their lives without me. The realization was devastating, but what made it worse was the growing suspicion that my family's attitude toward me wasn't unique. I started noticing how other elderly people in Riverside Falls were treated by their families, with polite tolerance rather than genuine respect, with dutiful visits rather than eager engagement, with managing strategies rather than celebrating. Appreciation. At the senior center where I volunteered twice a week, I heard similar stories from other women my age. Children who called only when they needed something. Grandchildren who visited out of obligation rather than affection. Families who included elderly members in their plans, but made it clear that accommodating their needs was an inconvenience. They love us, my friend Dorothy said one afternoon as we folded clothes for the charity drive. But they don't really like us anymore. We're reminders of what they're going to become, and that scares them. Dorothy's words hit me like a physical blow because they captured exactly what I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. My family loved me in the abstract. I was Mom, Grandma, the woman who'd raised them and supported them and been there for every crisis and celebration. But they didn't actually enjoy my company anymore. They didn't seek out my opinions or value my insights. They didn't find me interesting or funny or worth spending time with unless there was a specific purpose. I had become a functional family member rather than a cherished one, useful but not treasured, necessary but not wanted. And that realization was about to be confirmed in the most painful way possible, on a Thanksgiving evening that would change everything forever. The November day that would become the turning point of my life started like any other holiday preparation. I'd been cooking for 3 days, my famous herb-crusted turkey, homemade cranberry sauce with orange zest, sweet potato casserole with maple syrup glaze, green bean casserole with crispy onions made from scratch, and my signature pumpkin pie that the grandchildren always fought over. Jessica had offered to host Thanksgiving this year at her larger house, but she'd graciously allowed me to do most of the cooking because you're so much better at the traditional dishes, Mom. Translation. I would do the work, she would get the credit for hosting, and everyone would pretend this was a collaborative effort. I loaded my car with covered dishes, still warm from the oven, and drove the 15 minutes to Jessica's house. in the Hampton Heights subdivision, the part of town where successful people lived in houses with 3-car garages and professionally landscaped yards. Jessica's house was a beautiful colonial with white columns and a circular driveway, the kind of place I'd dreamed of living in when she and Michael were small and we were crowded into that tiny apartment. The gathering included Jessica and her 2 boys, Michael and Caroline with their 3 children, Jessica's ex-husband Robert. They'd maintained a friendly relationship for the kids' sake, Caroline's parents who were visiting from Florida, and Jessica's new boyfriend Derek, who I'd met only twice, but who seemed to think his presence made him qualified to offer opinions about family matters. 14 people total, representing 3 generations of family, plus the extended connections that come with modern blended families. It should have been a celebration of all we'd built together, all we'd overcome, all the love and support that had carried us through decades of challenges and changes. Instead, it became the moment when I finally understood exactly what my family really thought of me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about the conversation that changed everything, you need to understand just how carefully I'd been excluded from the planning of this gathering, and how that exclusion was about to make the final insult so much more devastating, because what my family didn't know was that I'd been keeping secrets of my own. Important secrets that would have changed everything if they'd bothered to ask the right questions or pay attention to the details of my life beyond what I could do for them. And those secrets were about to become the foundation of the most satisfying revenge any overlooked grandmother had ever engineered. The first sign that this Thanksgiving would be different came 3 weeks before the holiday, when Jessica called me on a Tuesday evening while I was watching Jeopardy and eating my usual dinner of soup and crackers. "Mom, we need to talk about Thanksgiving," she said without her usual pleasantries. "No, how are you feeling?" Or, "What did you do today?" Just straight to business, the way she spoke to vendors at the hospital where she worked as marketing director. "Course, sweetheart," I said, muting the television and settling into my favorite recliner. "I've already started planning the menu. I thought I'd try that new stuffing recipe with chestnuts and—" "Actually, Mom, that's what I wanted to discuss," Jessica interrupted. "Derek and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to modernize our approach to family gatherings." Derek, Jessica's boyfriend of 8 months who worked in corporate consulting and had opinions about everything, despite knowing nothing about our family's 48 years of traditions. Derek, who wore expensive suits and drove a BMW and had never experienced a holiday that wasn't catered by professionals. Derek, who had somehow convinced my daughter that the way we'd been celebrating Thanksgiving for decades was somehow inadequate. "What do you mean by modernize?" I asked carefully, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. "Well, you're 70 now, and all that cooking is such a huge burden for you. We thought it might be nice if everyone just brought something simple. You know, potluck style. Less stress for everyone, especially you." The word burden hit me like a slap, though I tried to tell myself she hadn't meant it the way it sounded. "Jessica, I love cooking for the family. It's not a burden at all. I've been preparing the Thanksgiving meal for 48 years, I know, Mom. You remind us every year." Her voice carried a note of exasperation that felt like a knife between my ribs. But times change. People's dietary restrictions change. The kids are older now and have different preferences. Maybe it's time to let someone else take the lead on holiday planning. Someone else. As if I were just anyone, just some random person who'd been temporarily filling a role that could easily be transferred to a more suitable candidate. Not the woman who'd created every tradition they claimed to love. Not the grandmother who'd made every holiday magical for 6 grandchildren. Not the mother who'd somehow managed to put elaborate celebrations on the table, even when money was so tight I sometimes skipped meals to afford the ingredients. "I understand if you want to make some changes," I said carefully, "but I'd love to still contribute. Maybe I could make a few of my traditional dishes and others could—" "Mom, honestly, some of your recipes are getting a little dated." Caroline's been wanting to try some new dishes she found on Pinterest, and the kids are really into more contemporary flavors. Plus, Derek has some dietary restrictions we need to accommodate. Dated. My recipes that had been perfected over decades, that the grandchildren had always devoured with enthusiasm, that had been the centerpiece of family. Celebrations for nearly 5 decades were now considered dated. Apparently, Pinterest and Derek's dietary restrictions were more important than 48 years of family tradition. What kind of dietary restrictions? I asked, genuinely trying to be accommodating despite the growing hurt in my chest. He's gluten-free, dairy-free, and he doesn't eat anything with processed sugar. Also, he's been reading about the environmental impact of turkey farming, so we're thinking of doing a plant-based main dish this year. Plant-based. No turkey, no traditional stuffing because of the gluten, no green bean casserole because of the dairy and the sauce, no pumpkin pie because of the processed sugar. Essentially, Derek's preferences were going to eliminate every single dish that had made our Thanksgiving special for decades. I see, I said quietly. So what would you like me to bring? Oh, you don't need to bring anything, Mom. Just bring yourself. We want you to be able to relax and enjoy the day without all that cooking stress. Just bring yourself. As if my presence alone was enough. As if my value to the family had nothing to do with the love and effort I poured into making their celebrations special. As if showing up empty-handed to eat someone else's Pinterest-inspired, Derek-approved meal was somehow a gift to me rather than a dismissal of everything I'd contributed for nearly 5 decades. Jessica, I'd really like to contribute something. Maybe I could make my cranberry sauce. It doesn't have gluten or dairy, and I could use honey instead of sugar. Mom, Caroline already ordered some fancy organic cranberry chutney from that gourmet market downtown. We're all set. All set, without me, without anything I might offer. Without any acknowledgement that perhaps the woman who'd been making Thanksgiving magical for this family since before Derek was born might have something valuable to contribute. Well, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Maybe I could help. With setup or cleanup? That's sweet, but we've got it handled. Derek's bringing his assistant to help serve, and we hired a cleaning service for afterward. We really want this to be a relaxing day for everyone. A cleaning service. They were paying strangers to clean up after Thanksgiving dinner rather than letting me help with dishes, something I'd done joyfully for decades because it meant extra time talking and laughing with my family while we worked together. All right then, I said, my voice smaller than I intended. What time should I be there? Let's say 3 o'clock. We're planning a late afternoon meal so Derek can get his morning workout in, and some people might want to leave early to avoid traffic. 3 o'clock for a late meal that would end early so people could avoid traffic. Not the leisurely all-day celebration we'd always had, where people arrived in the morning to help cook and stayed until evening to play games and tell stories. Just a brief, efficient gathering planned around Derek's workout schedule and everyone's desire to minimize their time commitment. After Jessica hung up, I sat in my recliner staring at the muted television screen where Alex Trebek was silently asking questions I couldn't hear. For the first time in 48 years, I would be attending Thanksgiving as a guest rather than the hostess. For the first time in my adult life, I would be sitting at someone else's table eating food I hadn't prepared, surrounded by family members who apparently preferred hired help to my assistance. The hurt was so deep I couldn't even cry. It felt like something fundamental had been torn away from me, some essential part of my identity that I'd never realized could be removed so casually. I was no longer the family's Thanksgiving organizer. I was just another mouth to feed, another person to accommodate, another elderly relative to manage. But that phone call was just the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, I received a series of small communications that made it increasingly clear how little my family valued my presence or opinions. Michael called the following weekend, ostensibly to check on me, but really to reinforce Jessica's message about the new Thanksgiving arrangements. Mom, Jessica told me about the change in plans for Thanksgiving, he said, while I could hear Caroline and the kids arguing in the background. I think it's really great that you'll be able to relax for once. I never minded the cooking, Michael. You know I know, but you're not getting any younger, and we don't want you to overexert yourself. Plus, Caroline's been wanting to try some new recipes, and this gives her a chance to contribute more. Caroline, who had been part of the family for 15 years and had never once offered to help with holiday cooking beyond bringing a store-bought dessert. Caroline, who spent Thanksgiving afternoons taking photos for social media while I worked in the kitchen making sure everything was perfect. Caroline, who was now going to contribute more by taking over the traditions I'd created and maintained for decades. That's nice, I said carefully. What is Caroline planning to make? Some kind of quinoa stuffing and a butternut squash soup. Very healthy, very contemporary. The kids are excited to try something new. The kids were excited to try something new. My grandchildren, who had always helped me make traditional stuffing and who looked forward to my green bean casserole every year, were apparently eager to abandon the foods they'd grown up loving in favor of quinoa and butternut squash. That sounds lovely, I lied. I'm sure everyone will enjoy it. You know, Mom, change can be good sometimes. Maybe it's time for the family to develop some new traditions. New traditions. As if the traditions we'd built together over decades were outdated artifacts that needed to be replaced, rather than treasured customs that connected us to our history and each other. As if the time and love and effort I'd invested in creating meaningful celebrations were now obstacles to progress, rather than foundations to build upon. The next blow came from an unexpected source. My grandson Tommy, Jessica's 16-year-old, son who had always been special to me because he was my first grandchild. Tommy had been the baby I rocked when Jessica was overwhelmed, the toddler who called me Guanma Woes and demanded extra bedtime stories, the child who used to spend entire weekends at my house building puzzles and learning to bake cookies. Tommy called me on a Thursday evening, which should have been wonderful because he rarely called anymore unless he needed something. But this call wasn't about connecting with his grandmother. It was about managing me. "Hey, Grandma Rose," he said in the careful tone teenagers use when they're delivering unwelcome news. "Mom asked me to call you about Thanksgiving." "Oh? What about it, sweetie?" "Well, she wanted me to let you know that Derek's assistant is going to be helping serve dinner so you don't need to worry about jumping up to help or anything. You can just sit and relax. Don't worry about jumping up to help." As if my instinct to be useful was a problematic behavior that needed to be managed, rather than a loving gesture that came from decades of caring for my family. As if my desire to contribute was an inconvenience that required prevention. "That's very thoughtful," I said, though my heart was breaking. "I appreciate you letting me know. Also, Mom wanted me to mention that Derek gets kind of uncomfortable when people ask a lot of questions about his work and stuff. He's pretty private, so maybe just keep the conversation light, you know? Keep the conversation light. Don't ask questions. Don't show interest in the man who is essentially replacing my role as holiday organizer. Don't be the curious, engaged grandmother I'd always been because it might make Derek uncomfortable." "Of course," I said quietly. "I understand. And Grandma? Mom also said to tell you that maybe you could come a little later than 3? Like 3:30 or 4? Derek likes to have some time to get settled before everyone arrives. Come later. Arrive after everyone else had already gathered, after the initial conversations and catching up had happened, after the family had already established the dynamic for the day. Show up as an afterthought rather than an integral part of the celebration." "That's fine, Tommy. I'll see you around 4 o'clock. "Great. And Grandma, don't bring any food, okay?" Mom was really serious about that. "We have everything covered. Don't bring food." The final nail in the coffin of my role as family caretaker. For 48 years, I had shown up to family gatherings with my arms full of dishes I'd spent days preparing with love. Now I was being explicitly instructed to arrive empty-handed, to contribute nothing except my physical presence, which apparently needed to be delayed, and managed to avoid inconveniencing Derek. After Tommy hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the recipe box that held 3 generations of family favorites. My mother's handwritten cards for German chocolate cake and beef stroganoff. My own carefully perfected recipes for the holiday dishes that had become family traditions. Notes and modifications accumulated over decades of cooking for people I loved, of adjusting flavors to accommodate changing tastes and dietary needs, of creating meals that would bring joy and comfort to my family. All of it was now apparently irrelevant, dated, unwanted, a burden that the family was relieved to be free of. But the final insult came 3 days before Thanksgiving, in a conversation that revealed just how little my family understood about who I really was and what I'd been quietly accomplishing, while they assumed I was just a lonely old woman with nothing to offer but free babysitting and emergency loans. Caroline called me on Sunday afternoon while I was reading in my garden room, surrounded by the plants I'd carefully tended for decades. The room was my sanctuary, filled with orchids and African violets and jasmine that bloomed year-round, creating a peaceful space where I could think and plan and dream about the future. "Rose, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," Caroline said in the artificially sweet voice she used when she wanted something. "I wanted to talk to you about something kind of sensitive." "Of course, dear. What's on your mind?" "Well, Michael, and I have been talking and we're a little concerned about you. You know, living alone in that big house, managing everything by yourself. We think it might be time to start considering some alternatives." Alternatives. The word hung in the air like a threat, loaded with implications that made my blood run cold. "What kind of alternatives, Caroline?" "There are some really lovely senior living communities in the area. Independent living, where you'd have your own apartment, but access to meals and activities and healthcare support. We think you might really enjoy the social aspect. Senior living communities." She was suggesting that I sell my home, the house I'd finally been able to buy after years of renting, the place where I'd raised my children and welcomed my grandchildren, the sanctuary I'd created with 40 years of careful decorating and gardening and memory-making. "I'm very happy in my home, Caroline. I'm not ready to consider moving." "Rose, I know it's hard to think about, but you're 70 years old. What happens if you fall? What happens if you get sick? We worry about you being isolated out there, especially in the winter. What happens if you fall? What happens if you get sick?" She was talking about me as if I were already incapacitated, already helpless, already a liability waiting to happen rather than a vibrant woman who was perfectly capable of managing her own life. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm in excellent health. My doctor says I have the vitality of someone 20 years younger. I walk 3 miles every day. I volunteer at the senior center twice a week, and I'm perfectly capable of caring for myself." "We know you're independent, Rose, but independence can be dangerous at your age. And honestly, maintaining that house must be such a financial strain on your Social Security. These senior communities are actually quite affordable when you factor in all the services they provide." Financial strain. Caroline assumed that I was struggling financially, that my Social Security barely covered my expenses, that I was one major repair bill away from financial disaster. She had no idea that I'd been investing wisely for decades, that my modest lifestyle was a choice rather than a necessity, that I had resources she couldn't even imagine. "My finances are quite stable, Caroline, but thank you for your concern." "Rose, I don't want to be indelicate, but we know what school secretaries made in the 80s and 90s. Even with Social Security, it can't be much. Michael and I have been talking about maybe helping you with the costs of a nice community where you'd be safer and happier. Helping me with the costs. They were offering to contribute to moving me into senior living, to subsidize my exile from the family home where I'd created so many memories, to pay for my removal from their daily lives while convincing themselves they were being generous and caring. That's very thoughtful but completely unnecessary. I'm perfectly comfortable financially. Rose, you don't have to be proud with us. We're family. If money is tight, we want to help. Michael's business is doing really well, and we're in a position to assist with transition costs, if money is tight. She couldn't conceive of any other reason why I might live modestly, why I might choose to spend my money on things other than luxury and display. She assumed that my small house and practical car meant I was struggling rather than saving, that my simple lifestyle reflected limitations rather than priorities. Caroline, I need you to understand something. I am not struggling financially. I am not lonely or isolated. I am not ready to give up my independence or my home. I appreciate your concern, but these decisions are mine to make. Of course, Rose. I didn't mean to overstep. It's just that we love you, and we want what's best for you. Sometimes what's best for us isn't what we want to hear, you know? What's best for you? The phrase that family members use when they want to control your choices while pretending to care about your welfare. What's best for you according to other people's assessment of your needs and capabilities? What's best for you as determined by people who think they understand your situation better than you do? I understand that you mean well, Caroline, but what's best for me is continuing to live my life the way I choose to live it. Okay, Rose, we'll table this conversation for now, but promise me you'll think about it? Maybe we could visit some places together just to see what's available? You might be surprised by how nice they are. Visit some places together. She wasn't going to drop this topic. This was the beginning of a campaign to convince me that I needed to be managed, housed, and supervised by professionals because my family had decided I was too old and too burdensome to remain in control of my own life. After Caroline hung up, I walked through my house with new eyes, seeing it as my family apparently saw it. A burden, a financial drain, a dangerous environment where an elderly woman might fall or get sick or become isolated. They didn't see the beautiful home I'd created, the garden I tended with love, the sanctuary where I'd found peace and purpose for decades. They saw a problem that needed to be solved, an obligation that needed to be managed, a responsibility they'd rather transfer to professionals. The pattern was becoming unmistakably clear. My family had decided that I was no longer capable of making my own decisions about where to live, what to cook, how to contribute to celebrations, or how to spend my time. They'd started planning my future without consulting me, making decisions about what was best for me based on their own convenience rather than my actual needs or desires. But what they didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about or pay attention to, was that I had been quietly building a life and resources far beyond their understanding. While they assumed I was just a lonely old woman living on Social Security and family charity, I had been making investments, maintaining relationships, and developing options that would shock them if they ever discovered the truth. The phone call with Caroline was my wake-up call. Not only did my family see me as a burden they wanted to manage out of their daily lives, but they were actively planning to make that happen. The senior living community conversation wasn't casual, concern. It was reconnaissance for a future intervention where they would pressure me to give up my independence for their peace of mind. I realized that Thanksgiving wasn't just going to be about new recipes and Derek's dietary restrictions. It was going to be the beginning of a family-wide effort to convince me that I needed to accept a smaller, more managed role in everyone's life. They were going to use the gathering to demonstrate how much better things worked without my involvement, how much more sophisticated and contemporary their celebrations could be when they weren't held back by my dated traditions and burdensome participation. They were planning to show me, gently, lovingly, but unmistakably, that I had become expendable. What they didn't realize was that I had been preparing for this moment in ways they couldn't imagine. Not preparing to be pushed aside or managed into irrelevance, but preparing to demonstrate just how catastrophically wrong they were about who I was and what I was capable of. The secrets I'd been keeping for decades were about to become the foundation of the most shocking revelation any family had ever experienced. And it was all going to start with 3 phone calls I would make after they delivered their final insult at Thanksgiving dinner. But first, I had to sit through the most humiliating meal of my life, surrounded by people who thought they were doing me a favor by excluding me from the traditions I'd created and the family I'd built with 48 years of unwavering love and sacrifice. They had no idea what was coming. No idea that the quiet, accommodating grandmother they'd taken for granted was about to disappear forever, leaving behind a woman they'd never bothered to really know, a woman with resources, connections, and capabilities that would fundamentally change the power dynamic of our family relationships. The countdown to my transformation had begun, and Thanksgiving dinner was going to be ground zero for the most satisfying revenge any overlooked family member had ever engineered. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of November drizzle that made everything look bleak and unwelcoming. I woke up at 6 a.m. as I had every Thanksgiving for 48 years, but for the first time in my adult life, I had nothing to do. No turkey to prep, no side dishes to prepare, no pies to bake. Just an empty day stretching ahead of me until 4 o'clock, when I would arrive at my daughter's house as a guest rather than the creator of the celebration. I made myself a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, sitting at my kitchen table where I'd spent countless early Thanksgiving mornings chopping vegetables and reviewing my cooking timeline. The silence felt wrong, unnatural. Every other year, my house had been filled with the sounds and smells of preparation, ovens preheating, mixers whirring, timers chiming as various dishes reached completion. Today, there was only the quiet tick of the wall clock and the occasional patter of rain against the windows. By 10 a.m., I was dressed in the navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Not too formal, not too casual, appropriate for a 70-year-old guest who needed to blend into the background and avoid making anyone uncomfortable. I'd even had my hair done at the salon the day before, hoping that looking my best might help me feel more confident about my diminished role in the family gathering. But as the hours crawled by, the hurt and anger I'd been suppressing for weeks began to surface. I found myself walking through my house, looking at the photo albums filled with decades of family celebrations where I was always at the center, carving turkeys, serving pie, surrounded by children and grandchildren who clearly adored their grandmother's cooking and attention. In every picture, I was smiling, busy, essential to the joy and warmth of the occasion. What had changed? When had I transformed from the beloved family matriarch to the burdensome elderly relative who needed to be managed and accommodated? When had my contributions become obstacles rather than gifts? When had my presence become something to tolerate, rather than celebrate? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Not just hurt, actually angry. For 48 years, I had poured my heart and soul into making holidays magical for my family. I had spent thousands of dollars on ingredients, hundreds of hours in preparation, decades of my life ensuring that every celebration was perfect. I had created traditions that my children claimed to love, recipes that my grandchildren requested year after year, memories that I thought would bind us together forever. And in return, they had decided I was too much trouble. Too old, too set. In my ways, too burdensome with my dated recipes and time-consuming preparations. They preferred Derek's dietary restrictions to my family traditions. They chose Caroline's Pinterest recipes over dishes that had been perfected through decades of love and care. They hired strangers to help with serving and cleanup, rather than allowing me to contribute in the ways I'd always contributed. By 2 o'clock, I was pacing my living room like a caged animal. The rational part of my mind kept telling me to be grateful that I was still included, to appreciate that my family was trying to give me a break from the work I'd always done. But the emotional part of my mind was screaming that this wasn't kindness. It was dismissal. This wasn't consideration. It was replacement. I almost didn't go. I stood by my front door at 3:30, car keys in hand, seriously considering calling Jessica to say I wasn't feeling well. I could spend the day alone, order Chinese takeout, and avoid the humiliation of sitting at someone else's table eating food that bore no resemblance to the traditions I'd spent decades creating. but I went. Not because I was looking forward to the gathering, but because something deep inside me needed to see exactly how far this dismissal of my value would go. I needed to witness firsthand what my family celebration looked like without my involvement. I needed to understand exactly what I meant to these people I'd loved and supported for 50 years. The drive to Jessica's house took 15 minutes through neighborhoods decorated with autumn wreaths and carved pumpkins, past houses where other families were probably gathering around tables laden with traditional foods prepared by grandmothers who were still valued for their contributions. I pulled into Jessica's circular driveway behind cars I recognized, Michael's pickup truck, Caroline's SUV, Robert's sedan, and a sleek black BMW that must belong to Derek. Derek's car was positioned closest to the front door, as if he were the guest of honor rather than a relative newcomer to family gatherings. My usual parking spot, the space closest to the kitchen door where I'd always parked to make unloading my dishes easier, was occupied by Caroline's vehicle. A small thing, but symbolic of how thoroughly I'd been displaced from my traditional role. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gathering courage and trying to prepare myself for whatever this new version of Thanksgiving might look like. Through the large front windows, I could see people moving around inside. Adults holding wine glasses, children running between rooms, the warm glow of lamps and candles creating exactly the kind of cozy atmosphere I'd always tried to create, in my own home. When I finally walked up to the front door, I could hear laughter and conversation from inside. The family gathering was already in full swing, already warm and comfortable and complete without me. I was arriving as an afterthought, a late addition to a celebration that had been planned and executed without any input from the woman who'd orchestrated every family holiday for nearly 5 decades. Jessica opened the door wearing an elegant burgundy dress and a smile that looked more polite than genuinely welcoming. "Mom, perfect timing. We were just about to start serving." Perfect timing. As if my arrival had been coordinated to coincide with the moment when my presence would be most convenient for everyone else's schedule. Not, "We've been waiting for you," or, "We're so glad you're here." Just acknowledgement that I'd arrived at the designated time. The house smelled wonderful, I had to admit. Unfamiliar but appetizing aromas wafted from the kitchen. Roasted vegetables, herbs I couldn't identify. Something savory and sophisticated that bore no resemblance to the comfort food scents that had always defined Thanksgiving in my memory. "Derek, this is my mother Rose," Jessica said, guiding me toward a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive sweater who was holding court near the fireplace. "Mom, Derek has been so excited to finally have a real conversation with you." Derek extended his hand with the confident smile of someone accustomed to making good first impressions. "Rose, it's wonderful to see you again. Jessica talks about you constantly. Constantly." I doubted that, given how little Jessica and I had spoken. In recent months, beyond logistics and brief check-ins, but Derek's tone was warm and respectful, and I found myself wondering if perhaps I'd been too quick to resent his influence on the family's holiday plans. "It's nice to see you too, Derek. Jessica tells me you've been very involved in the planning. This year?" "Well, I just offered a few suggestions based on some dietary research I've been doing. The connection between nutrition and longevity is fascinating, especially for people in their golden years." People in their golden years. He was talking about me, classifying me as someone whose age required special dietary considerations, someone whose health and vitality were already compromised enough to warrant intervention. At 70, I was apparently in the demographic that needed to be protected from traditional holiday foods for their own good. "I appreciate your concern for everyone's health," I said carefully. "But I've been eating traditional Thanksgiving foods for 70 years and I seem to be doing just fine." Derek laughed in the indulgent way people laugh at elderly relatives who don't understand modern science. "Oh, I'm sure you are. But you know, preventive nutrition is so important as we age. The compounds in processed foods can be particularly challenging for older digestive systems. Processed foods. He was explaining nutrition to me as if I were a child who didn't understand the basics of healthy eating, as if my 70 years of life experience were less valuable than whatever articles he'd read about longevity diets. Before I could respond, Michael appeared with a glass of wine and a bear hug that felt more genuine than anything else I'd encountered since arriving. "Mom, you look beautiful. How are you feeling? Ready for a relaxing Thanksgiving where you don't have to lift a finger?" Don't have to lift a finger. As if cooking for my family had been a burden I was grateful to escape rather than a labor of love I'd always cherished. As if being useful was something I needed to be protected from rather than something that gave my life meaning and purpose. "I'm doing well, sweetheart. Everything smells wonderful. Caroline must have been cooking all day. Actually, most of the food was catered," Michael said with obvious pride. Caroline found this amazing farm-to-table place that specializes in healthy holiday menus. Everything's organic, locally sourced, and designed by actual nutritionists. Much better than all that heavy traditional stuff. Much better than all that heavy traditional stuff. My son was dismissing 48 years of family recipes, 48 years of meals I'd prepared with love and care, as heavy traditional stuff that had apparently been inferior to catered organic food designed by nutritionists. "That sounds lovely," I managed, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. The conversation continued as other family members joined our circle. Caroline appeared with updates about the timing of dinner service. Robert shared stories about his latest golf achievements. The grandchildren drifted in and out of adult conversations, more interested in their phones and each other than in spending time with the adults. But I noticed something troubling in these interactions. When people spoke to me, their voices carried a particular tone. The careful, slightly loud tone people use when talking to elderly relatives they assume might not hear or understand clearly. They asked simple questions about my health and my routine, but showed no interest in my opinions about current events, family decisions, or anything requiring complex thought. When Derek mentioned a documentary about financial planning for retirement, everyone in the circle nodded and engaged with his ideas. When I tried to contribute my own thoughts about investment strategies based on decades of successful money management, the conversation quickly shifted to other topics. My insights weren't valued or even acknowledged. They were politely ignored as the ramblings of an old woman who probably didn't understand modern financial concepts. "Dinner's ready," Caroline announced from the dining room doorway, and we all began moving toward the table that had been set with Jessica's good china and what appeared to be professionally arranged centerpieces. The dining room table looked beautiful, I had to admit. Elegant and sophisticated in a way that my traditional orange and gold decorations had never achieved. Caroline had clearly put considerable thought and effort into creating a visually stunning presentation that would look perfect in social media. Photos. But as I looked at the table, I realized that everything about this gathering had been designed to exclude me. The menu was based on Derek's preferences. The decorations reflected Caroline's aesthetic. The timing accommodated everyone's schedule except mine. I'd been told to arrive after the initial social hour, after the family had already bonded, and caught up without me. Even the seating arrangement told a story. Derek sat at the head of the table in the position that had traditionally been reserved for the family patriarch. First my father, then Frank, then eventually me as the family matriarch. Jessica sat to his right in the hostess position. The four grandchildren were clustered together in the middle of the table where they could easily interact with each other. Michael and Caroline occupied the positions next to their children, and I was seated at the foot of the table, physically separated from the main conversations, positioned like an honored guest rather than an integral family member. Politely included, but clearly peripheral to the real dynamics of the gathering. As we began eating, I had to acknowledge that the food was actually quite good. The quinoa stuffing was flavorful and interesting. The butternut squash soup was elegant and warming. The roasted vegetables were perfectly seasoned. Caroline and Derek had chosen well. and the catered meal was undoubtedly healthier and more sophisticated than anything I would have prepared. But it wasn't our food. It wasn't the dishes that connected us to our history, our traditions, our shared memories of decades of celebrations. It was generic holiday food that could have been served at any upscale restaurant, food that bore no emotional connection to our family story or the woman who'd spent 48 years creating those connections. The conversation flowed around topics that had nothing to do with me. Derek told entertaining stories about his travels. Caroline shared updates about her yoga classes and the celebrities who'd been spotted at her studio. Michael discussed the luxury homes his construction company was building for wealthy clients. Jessica talked about her latest marketing campaigns for the hospital. Everyone was successful, sophisticated, living lives full of interesting experiences and professional achievements. And sitting at the foot of the table, I felt like a relic from a simpler time when families gathered around homemade food and shared stories about their ordinary, unglamorous lives. When Tommy started talking about his part-time job at the electronics store, I tried to show interest and ask questions about his work experience. But my questions were met with polite, brief answers that made it clear he considered his grandmother's curiosity intrusive rather than caring. When I mentioned that I'd been reading about the technology industry and had some thoughts about his potential career directions, Derek interrupted to share his own expertise about the field, effectively ending my contribution to the conversation. The pattern repeated throughout the meal. Every time I tried to engage meaningfully with family members, my attempts were either ignored, redirected, or overshadowed by someone else's more authoritative voice. I was being treated like a sweet but somewhat senile elderly relative whose comments were tolerated rather than valued. The breaking point came during dessert, when Caroline proudly presented a selection of organic, gluten-free, dairy-free pastries from an expensive bakery downtown. They were beautiful and undoubtedly delicious, but they bore no resemblance to the pumpkin pie that had been my signature dessert for 48 years, the recipe that had been passed down from my mother and perfected through decades of family feedback. "These look wonderful, Caroline," I said genuinely. "Though I have to admit, I miss my traditional pumpkin pie. Maybe next year I could make my regular recipe alongside these healthier options." The suggestion was met with a moment of uncomfortable silence. Jessica and Caroline exchanged a look that I pretended not to notice. Derek cleared his throat as if preparing to deliver difficult news. "Rose," Derek said in the gentle but patronizing tone reserved for explaining reality to confused elderly people. "I think what we're all learning is that family traditions sometimes need to evolve. The recipes and approaches that worked for previous generations might not be the best choices for modern families." Previous generations. He was classifying me as a previous generation, as someone whose time had passed, whose knowledge and preferences were outdated and irrelevant to the current family dynamic. "I understand that," I said carefully, "but some traditions are worth preserving alongside new approaches. There's room for both old and new, isn't there?" "Of course there is," Jessica said quickly, shooting Derek a warning look. "But you know, Mom, we're all just trying to be more health conscious these days. The kids are growing up with different expectations about food and nutrition. The kids are growing up with different expectations, as if my grandchildren, who had always devoured my cooking with enthusiasm, had spontaneously developed sophisticated palates that couldn't tolerate their grandmother's traditional recipes, as if their expectations had nothing to do with the adults who were teaching them to prefer expensive bakery items over homemade desserts made with love. I could adjust my recipes to be healthier, I offered. Use natural sweeteners, whole, grain flours, whatever modifications would make them more appropriate. "Mom," Michael said with strained patience, "it's not just about ingredients. It's about letting other people contribute too. You've done so much for so many years. Maybe it's time to let Caroline and Jessica take the lead on holiday planning. Let other people contribute. Take the lead." He was telling me that my decades of leadership and contribution had become obstacles to other people's participation, that my willingness to cook and organize had somehow prevented others from being involved. As if my competence and dedication were character flaws that needed to be corrected. "I never meant to prevent anyone else from contributing," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "I always welcomed help. I just wanted to make sure our traditions continued." "But that's exactly the problem, Grandma," said Emma, Caroline's 14-year-old daughter, with the casual cruelty that teenagers can deliver without realizing the impact of their words. "Your traditions are kind of old-fashioned. Like, nobody really eats that heavy food anymore except old people." Old people. My granddaughter had just classified me as an old person whose food preferences were outdated and irrelevant to modern family life. The child I'd helped raise, whose diapers I'd changed and whose homework I'd supervised, was dismissing my contributions as the quaint preferences of someone too elderly to understand contemporary tastes. The silence that followed Emma's comment was deafening. I waited for someone to correct her, to remind her that speaking disrespectfully to her grandmother was unacceptable, to defend the woman who'd spent decades making holidays magical for the entire family. But no one said anything. Michael cleared, his throat uncomfortably. Jessica studied her dessert plate with sudden fascination. Caroline gave Emma a mild look that suggested the comment had been tactless, but not entirely wrong. Derek nodded slightly, as if Emma had articulated something the adults had been thinking but were too polite to say directly. My granddaughter had just called me old and irrelevant, and every adult at the table was going to let it pass without comment. "Emma," I said quietly, "I've been making those recipes for your entire family since before you were born. Your father and aunt grew up on that food. They never complained about it being old-fashioned." "Yeah, but that was like a long time ago," Emma said with the dismissive confidence of adolescence. "People didn't know as much about nutrition back then. Plus, everything was different. Everything was different." She was talking about my life, my experiences, my decades of family service as ancient history that had no relevance to the current moment. To her, I wasn't a woman with valuable knowledge and experience. I was a relic from a long time ago, when people didn't know better. "Emma's not wrong," said Jeremy, Michael's 17-year-old son, jumping into the conversation with the thoughtless enthusiasm of someone who'd found a topic where he could sound sophisticated. "I've been reading about how processed foods and refined sugars affect cognitive function in aging populations. Maybe switching to healthier options is actually better for Grandma Rose, too." Better for Grandma Rose. My grandson was explaining to me what was good for my health, based on articles he'd read, dismissing my 70 years of life experience and excellent health as irrelevant to decisions about my own well-being. He was treating me like a patient who needed to be managed rather than a person capable of making my own choices. "I appreciate your concern, Jeremy," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But I think I'm capable of making my own decisions about what foods are appropriate for me." "Of course you are, Grandma," Jeremy said in the condescending tone teenagers use when they're pretending to be respectful while actually being dismissive. "But sometimes we all need help making the best choices, especially as we get older, and maybe don't keep up with the latest research." "Don't keep up with the latest research." He was assuming that my age meant I was intellectually stagnant, incapable of learning new information or adapting to changing knowledge. To him, being 70 meant being frozen in time, unable to grow or change or understand modern concepts. And still, no adult at the table corrected him or defended me. My son and daughter, who'd been raised to respect their elders and value family relationships, were allowing their teenage children to speak to their grandmother as if she were a confused patient who needed guidance and management rather than respect and consideration. That's when Derek decided to offer his own contribution to the conversation about my limitations and irrelevance. "You know, Rose," he said with the confident authority of someone who'd made a career out of telling people how to improve their lives, "this might be a perfect opportunity for you to explore some new interests. Now that the family has evolved, past needing you to handle all the cooking and hosting responsibilities, you could focus on activities that are more age-appropriate and fulfilling for someone in your stage of life. Activities that are more age-appropriate. Someone in your stage of life. He was talking to me like I was a client in need of life coaching, someone whose current activities were inappropriate for my age and circumstances, someone who needed professional guidance to find suitable ways to spend my remaining years. What kind of activities would those be, Derek? I asked, genuinely curious about what this man who'd known me for 8 months thought would be appropriate ways for me to fill my time. Well, there are so many wonderful options for active seniors these days. Book clubs, volunteer work with simple tasks, gentle exercise classes, arts and crafts groups, things that provide social interaction without the stress and physical demands of major holiday preparation. Simple tasks, gentle exercise, arts and crafts. He was describing activities appropriate for someone with limited physical and mental capabilities, someone who needed to be protected from stress and challenge, someone whose best years were behind her, and who should focus on pleasant but undemanding ways to pass time. I already volunteer at the senior center, I said carefully. I coordinate their financial literacy program and help seniors understand investment options and retirement planning. That's wonderful, Derek said with the enthusiasm people show when elderly relatives demonstrate they can still function independently. Sharing your life experience with other seniors is such a valuable contribution. Sharing your life experience. He'd managed to take my professional-level volunteer work and reframe it as elderly reminiscence, as if my financial knowledge was valuable only as historical perspective rather than current expertise. Actually, Derek, I said, my patience finally beginning to fray. It's not about sharing life experience. I hold a certification in financial planning, and I help seniors make complex investment decisions that affect their current and future financial security. Derek's smile became slightly strained, as if he weren't sure whether to believe that I had actual professional credentials, or whether this was the kind of exaggeration elderly people sometimes make about their capabilities. That's impressive. Rose, I'm sure your practical experience is very helpful to people in similar situations. Practical experience. Similar situations. He was patronizing me, dismissing my professional qualifications as the kind of informal knowledge that one senior might share with another, rather than acknowledging that I might actually have expertise that extended beyond my demographic group. And that's when Jessica decided to deliver the blow that would change everything forever. Mom, Jessica said with the weary tone of someone who'd been patient long enough, I think what Derek is trying to say, and what we've all been thinking, is that maybe it's time for you to accept that your role in the family is changing. You've done so much for so many years, but now it's time for you to step back and let other people take responsibility. Step back. Let other people take responsibility. She was telling me that my decades of service had earned me the right to become irrelevant, that my reward for 50 years of family devotion was to be gently pushed aside so younger, more capable people could take over. I'm not ready to step back, Jessica. I still have a lot to offer. Of course you do, Mom. But your idea of what you have to offer might be different from what the family actually needs right now. What the family actually needs. She was telling me that my perception of my own value was wrong, that my willingness to contribute was no longer aligned with the family's requirements, that I had become someone who offered things nobody wanted. What does the family need, Jessica? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to hear the answer. Jessica looked around the table, making eye contact with Michael, Caroline, and Derek as if seeking support for what she was about to say. The grandchildren were listening with the fascinated attention people show when they sense family drama developing. Mom, we need you to accept that you're 70 years old. We need you to acknowledge that you can't do everything you used to do. We need you to stop trying to control every family gathering and let other people make decisions about how we celebrate holidays. Stop trying to control. She was reframing my leadership and organization as control, my decades of successful holiday planning as inappropriate interference in other people's authority. I've never tried to control anything, Jessica. I've tried to preserve traditions and make sure everyone felt included and celebrated. But that's exactly what we mean, Mom, Michael said, jumping in to support his sister. Your way of including people is to do everything yourself. You don't let anyone else contribute because you have such specific ideas about how things should be done. I don't let anyone else contribute. They were rewriting history, creating a narrative where my competence and dedication had somehow prevented others from participating, where my willingness to handle complex tasks had been selfishness rather than service. I always welcomed help, I said, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to stay calm. I asked for help. I begged for help sometimes. But when people didn't follow through, I did what needed to be done to make sure family celebrations happened. And that's the problem, Caroline said, speaking for the first time since the conversation had taken this turn. You have this need to make sure everything happens your way. You can't let go of control long enough to see that maybe other people have good ideas too. Your way. They were characterizing my traditional recipes and celebration styles as personal preferences rather than family traditions, as my arbitrary choices rather than customs that had been developed and refined through decades of family input and enjoyment. Caroline, I've been cooking the same recipes for 48 years because that's what everyone always said they loved. If people wanted changes, why didn't they tell me? Because you get so invested in doing things your way that it's easier to just let you handle everything than to hurt your feelings by suggesting alternatives, Jessica said with obvious frustration. But now we're all adults with our own ideas, and we want to be able to contribute without having to work around your expectations. Work around your expectations. She was making my standards and traditions sound like obstacles that had been preventing the family from expressing their creativity and preferences, as if my 48 years of successful holiday planning had been barriers to overcome rather than foundations to build upon. I never knew you felt that way, I said quietly. If my cooking and planning were problems, why didn't anyone ever tell me? Because we didn't want to hurt you, Mom, Michael said, with the careful patience of someone explaining something obvious to a confused person. But you're so sensitive about family traditions and your cooking that it's been impossible to have honest conversations about making changes. So sensitive. They were pathologizing my emotional investment in family relationships, making my care and dedication sound like character flaws that had prevented honest communication. I would have listened if anyone had wanted to discuss changes, I said, though I was beginning to doubt everything I thought I knew about my relationships with these people. Would you, though? Derek asked, inserting himself into the family discussion with the confidence of someone who believed his outside perspective gave him special insight. Because from what I've observed, you have a pretty strong emotional attachment to doing things the way they've always been done. Emotional attachment. He was psychoanalyzing me, reducing my dedication to family traditions to some kind of unhealthy fixation that prevented rational decision-making. I have an emotional attachment to my family, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I have an emotional attachment to making sure the people I love feel celebrated and cared for. And that's beautiful, Rose, Derek said with the condescending warmth of a therapist addressing a difficult patient. But sometimes emotional attachments can become limiting. Sometimes they can prevent us from seeing new possibilities or adapting to changing circumstances. Limiting. He was telling me that my love for my family had become a problem, that my dedication to their happiness was preventing me from accepting that they no longer wanted or needed what I had to offer. What changing circumstances? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Mom, Jessica said with the gentle firmness of someone delivering bad news. The changing circumstance is that you're getting older and we're all getting busier. And the way we've been doing holidays just isn't working for anyone anymore. Isn't working for anyone, She was speaking for the entire family, declaring that my contributions had become problems for everyone, that my decades of service had somehow transformed into burdens that nobody wanted to carry. "It's been working fine for me," I said quietly. "But that's the thing, Mom," Jessica said, her voice taking on an edge of impatience that I'd never heard her use with me before. "It's not just about what works for you anymore. You can't expect the entire family to accommodate your needs and preferences when they don't match what everyone else wants. Your needs and preferences." She was reframing my desire to contribute to family celebrations as selfish demands that other people were being forced to accommodate. My willingness to cook and organize had somehow become impositions on everyone else's freedom to celebrate differently. "I didn't realize I was imposing on anyone," I said, feeling tears beginning to burn behind my eyes. "I thought I was contributing." "You were contributing, Grandma," said Tommy with the awkward kindness of a teenager who sensed he was witnessing something painful, but didn't understand the full context. "But maybe it's time for other people to contribute too. Other people to contribute too." Even my 16-year-old grandson was treating me like someone who'd been hogging opportunities, rather than someone who'd been carrying responsibilities that other people could have shared anytime they wanted. "I never stopped anyone from contributing," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not intentionally," Caroline said with the carefully neutral tone of someone trying to be diplomatic. "But Rose, you have to admit that you do everything so thoroughly. It's hard for other people to feel like their contributions matter when you're handling every detail. So thoroughly." She was making my competence sound like a character flaw, my attention to detail sound like a barrier to other people's participation. And that's when Derek delivered the final insult that would trigger my complete transformation. "Rose," he said with the gentle authority of someone who'd appointed himself as the family's voice of reason, "I think what everyone is trying to tell you, as kindly as possible, is that you've become a bit of a burden on the family's ability to evolve and grow. A burden." The word hit me like a physical blow, so shocking and painful that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Derek. This man who'd known my family for 8 months, who'd been dating my daughter for less than a year, who knew nothing about the 48 years of sacrifice and service I'd poured into building and maintaining these relationships, had just called me a burden, and nobody corrected him. I looked around the table, waiting for someone to object, to defend me, to remind Derek that he had no right to characterize my role in a family he'd barely joined. I waited for Jessica to tell her boyfriend that he'd crossed a line. I waited for Michael to stand up for his mother. I waited for any of the grandchildren to remember the woman who'd helped raise them, who'd been there for every crisis and celebration of their lives. But the silence stretched on. Jessica stared at her plate. Michael examined his wineglass. Caroline focused on folding her napkin. The grandchildren looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Nobody was going to defend me. Nobody was going to correct Derek's assessment. Nobody was going to point out that the woman he'd just called a burden had spent 5 decades making their lives easier, happier, and more secure. "A burden," I repeated quietly, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "Rose, I didn't mean—" Derek started, apparently realizing that his choice of words had been harsher than intended. "No," I said, holding up my hand to stop him. "You meant exactly what you said. I've become a burden. My cooking is a burden. My traditions are a burden. My desire to contribute to my family's happiness has become a burden that you all need to be relieved of." "Mom, that's not—" Jessica began. "It is, Jessica," I said, standing up from my chair with a calmness that surprised me. "It's exactly what you all think. You've been planning this conversation for weeks, haven't you? You've been discussing how to manage the burden of including me in family celebrations. You've been strategizing about how to convince me to step aside so you can all enjoy yourselves without having to accommodate my outdated preferences." The silence that followed confirmed everything I needed to know. This hadn't been a spontaneous conversation. This had been a planned intervention, a family-wide decision to address the problem of my continued involvement in their lives. You invited me here today not to celebrate Thanksgiving with me, but to tell me that I'm no longer welcome to participate in the traditions I created, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. You wanted me to see how much better everything could be without my contributions. You wanted me to understand that my time is over and my role is finished. Mom, please sit down, Michael said, looking genuinely distressed. We're not trying to exclude you. We're trying to help you transition to a different kind of involvement. A different kind of involvement. Code words for diminished participation, for being managed into irrelevance, for accepting that I was no longer capable of meaningful contribution to my family's life. I understand completely, I said, walking around the table to where my purse sat on the sideboard. You've all made your position very clear. I'm a burden who needs to be managed. An elderly woman whose contributions are no longer valued. Someone whose time has passed. Rose, you're being dramatic, Derek said with the irritation of someone whose carefully planned intervention wasn't going according to script. We're trying to have an honest conversation about family dynamics, and you're taking everything personally. He was dismissing my emotional response to being called a burden as an overreaction, as if there were some objective way to respond to being told by your family that you'd become an impediment to their happiness. Derek, I said, turning to face him directly. You're absolutely right. I am taking this personally. When my family tells me I'm a burden, I take that very personally indeed. I picked up my purse and looked around the table one more time, at these people I'd loved and served and sacrificed for through 5 decades of my life, at the children I'd raised who were now too polite to defend me from insults, at the grandchildren I'd helped nurture who now saw me as an outdated relic from a previous generation, at the family I'd built with my own hands who had decided I was an obstacle to their continued growth and happiness. Thank you for a very enlightening Thanksgiving, I said with perfect politeness. I finally understand exactly where I stand, with all of you. I finally know exactly what my 48 years of devotion have earned me. Mom, don't leave like this, Jessica said, finally standing up from her chair. We can work this out. We can find a way for everyone to be happy. Jessica, I said, my hand on the front door handle, you've already found a way for everyone to be happy. You found a way to have family celebrations without the burden of including me. I hope you all enjoy your new traditions. Grandma Rose, please don't go, said little Sophie, Caroline's 8-year-old daughter, the only person at the table who seemed genuinely distressed by my departure. I want you to stay. I looked down at Sophie's worried face, the only face in the room that showed real concern about my leaving, and felt my heart break a little more. This beautiful child was the only family member who seemed to value my presence, and she was too young to understand the dynamics that had led to this moment. I love you, Sophie, I said, bending down to give her a hug. I love all of you, but sometimes loving people means giving them the space to live their lives the way they want to live them, without the burden of people who no longer fit. I straightened up and looked at Jessica one last time. Thank you for helping me understand what I really mean to this family. It's been educational. And then I walked out into the cold November evening, leaving behind the family gathering that had been designed to show me my place in their world, which was apparently no place at all. I sat in my car in Jessica's driveway for several minutes, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. For 48 years, I had believed that I was building something precious and permanent. I had believed that my love and service and sacrifice were creating bonds that would last forever, that my contributions were valued and appreciated, that my place in the family was secure and honored. I had been wrong about everything. The family I thought I'd created didn't actually exist. The relationships I thought I'd built were apparently one-sided obligations that had become burdensome to maintain. The love I thought was mutual had transformed into tolerance, and even that tolerance had reached its limits. Derek had called me a burden, and nobody had defended me. My own children had allowed a relative stranger to insult their mother, to dismiss her decades of devotion, to declare her an impediment to the family's happiness. My grandchildren had participated in explaining why my contributions were no longer wanted, why my preferences were outdated, why my presence was more obligation than pleasure. The devastating truth was that they were probably right. I had become a burden, not intentionally, not maliciously, but through the simple process of aging in a family that valued innovation over tradition, efficiency over sentiment, contemporary preferences over historical connections. I had become the old woman who insisted on doing things the way they'd always been done, who couldn't adapt to changing tastes and dietary restrictions, who expected the family to accommodate her needs rather than accepting that her time had passed. I had become exactly what elderly women become when they outlive their usefulness, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be celebrated. But as I drove home through the dark streets of Riverside Falls, something unexpected began to happen. The hurt and humiliation I'd felt at Jessica's table began to transform into something else, something harder and more determined. Anger. Not just hurt, but genuine anger at the way I'd been dismissed and disrespected. Anger at the assumption that my age meant my contributions were automatically less valuable. Anger at being characterized as a burden by people who had benefited from my generosity for decades. Anger at myself for accepting the role of the grateful grandmother who should be thankful for whatever scraps of attention her family was willing to offer. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the anger had crystallized into something I'd never felt before. Determination to prove them wrong. Determination to show them exactly what they were losing when they decided I was a burden. Determination to demonstrate that the quiet, accommodating grandmother they'd dismissed was not the only version of Rose Whitman that existed. I walked into my house and stood in the living room that held 60 years of memories, looking at the photo albums and scrapbooks that documented a lifetime of service to people who had just told me I was an obstacle to their happiness. I looked at the furniture I'd carefully chosen and maintained, the decorations that reflected decades of thoughtful homemaking, the evidence of a life lived with purpose and dedication. And I realized that this life, this house, this identity, this role was something I'd chosen, not something that had been imposed on me. I had chosen to dedicate my life to serving my family, to making their lives easier and happier, to sacrificing my own desires for their benefit. I had chosen to be the dependable grandmother who was always available, always helpful, always grateful, for whatever attention they were willing to spare. But I could choose differently. I could choose to stop being the accommodating woman who accepted whatever role the family assigned to her. I could choose to stop being grateful for inclusion and start demanding respect. I could choose to show them exactly what my presence in their lives had been worth and what its absence would cost them. I could choose to disappear. Not just physically, but completely. I could remove myself from their lives so thoroughly that they would finally understand what they had lost when they decided I was a burden. I could give them exactly what they wanted, a family life free from my outdated preferences and burdensome expectations, and let them discover for themselves whether that was really what would make them happy. But this wouldn't be a dramatic gesture or an emotional outburst. This would be strategic, planned, and permanent. I would disappear so completely that they would never find me unless I wanted to be found. And while they were searching and worrying and finally realizing what they had lost, I would be living a life that proved everything they thought they knew about me was wrong. I walked to the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers and pulled out the address book I'd maintained for decades. There, on page 23, were 3 phone numbers I'd never expected to use, but had always kept updated, just in case. 3 numbers that represented possibilities I'd never seriously considered, connections I'd maintained but never activated, resources I'd developed but never utilized. 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first number belonged to my financial advisor, Patricia Reynolds, who had been managing my investments for 20 years, but who had never met any of my family members because I'd never mentioned the full scope of my financial resources to anyone. Patricia, who would be very interested to learn that her client was ready to make some major life changes that would require significant financial planning and legal preparation. The second number belonged to Dr. Margaret Chen, the estate planning attorney who had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, but who had never discussed my comprehensive will and trust arrangements with anyone in my family. Dr. Chen, who would need to make some substantial modifications to ensure that my estate planning reflected my new understanding of family relationships and priorities. The third number belonged to Elena Morrison, my former colleague from the financial literacy program at the Senior Center, who had been trying to convince me for 3 years to join her in a business venture that would utilize my expertise in ways I'd never allowed myself to consider. Elena, who had resources and connections that would make it possible for me to disappear from Riverside Falls completely while building a new life that my family would never imagine. It was 8:30 p.m. when I made the first call. By 11 p.m., I had set in motion a plan that would take approximately 4 months to complete. 4 months during which I would quietly prepare for the most dramatic transformation any dismissed grandmother had ever achieved. My family thought they knew who Rose Whitman was. They thought they understood my capabilities, my resources, my options. They thought I was a limited woman with limited possibilities, someone whose best years were behind her and whose future involved accepting whatever diminished role they were willing to offer. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they had been about everything. The woman who had accepted being called a burden was about to disappear forever. In her place would emerge someone they had never bothered to know, someone with resources they'd never suspected, capabilities they'd never recognized, and options they'd never imagined. The transformation had begun, and there would be no going back. But first, I had 4 months of careful planning ahead of me, 4 months of quietly selling property, transferring assets, making arrangements, and preparing for a life that would prove to my family that they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. 4 months to plan the most satisfying disappearance any burden had ever engineered, and the best part was, they would never see it coming. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up at 5:30 a.m., feeling more clear-headed and purposeful than I had in years. The hurt from the previous evening had crystallized overnight into something harder and more useful, absolute certainty about what I needed to do. I made my coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, just as I had done countless times, when planning family celebrations or organizing household projects. But this time, I was planning something entirely different. I was planning the complete disappearance of Rose Whitman, burden grandmother, and the emergence of someone my family had never bothered to discover. The first call I'd made the night before had been to Patricia Reynolds, my financial advisor. Patricia had been managing my investment portfolio for 20 years, but she'd always respected my request for discretion about my financial affairs. What my family didn't know, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that the modest school secretary who'd raised 2 children on a tiny salary had been making very strategic financial decisions for the past 5 decades. "Rose?" Patricia had said when I called at 8:30 p.m. "I have to say, I've been waiting for this conversation for years. You've built something remarkable, and it's about time you started enjoying it." What Patricia knew, and what my family would discover too late, was that I wasn't dependent on Social Security and family charity. I wasn't the financially vulnerable elderly woman that Caroline had assumed when she offered to help with senior living costs. I was, in fact, worth considerably more than any of them realized. It had started small, in the 1980s, when I'd begun investing my modest savings in mutual funds and government bonds. Nothing dramatic, just consistent contributions from a woman who'd learned to live frugally and save carefully. but over 40 years. With compound interest and smart reinvestment strategies, those small contributions had grown into something substantial. Then, in the 1990s, I'd used some of my accumulated savings to buy rental properties, small houses and duplexes, in neighborhoods that I recognized were about to appreciate in value. While my children were focused on their careers and growing families, I was quietly building a real estate portfolio that generated steady monthly income and had tripled in value over the past 2 decades. By 2010, I'd expanded into commercial real estate, purchasing small office buildings and retail spaces that provided even better returns. I'd also diversified into blue-chip stocks, international funds, and carefully selected growth investments that had performed better than I'd ever dared to hope. The woman my family saw as a burden living on fixed income actually had a net worth approaching $3 million, generated passive income of over $180,000 annually, and had been philanthropically supporting various charities for years without ever mentioning it to anyone. "Patricia," I'd said during our conversation, "I want to liquidate everything. I want to convert all my assets to portable investments and prepare for a complete relocation. How quickly can that be accomplished?" "Interesting," Patricia had replied, with the satisfaction of someone who'd been hoping for this development. "Complete liquidation would take about 90 days if we do it systematically to avoid market disruption. Where are you thinking of relocating?" "I'm not sure yet. Somewhere warm, with good healthcare facilities and interesting cultural activities. Somewhere my family would never think to look for me." "Rose, you know this is going to be a substantial amount of money to manage for relocation. Have you considered what you want to do with your life once you've made this change?" That's when I'd shared something with Patricia that I'd never shared with my family. For the past 5 years, I'd been developing a business plan for a consulting company that would help seniors navigate financial planning, investment strategies, and retirement transitions. I'd been researching the market, developing curriculum, and even obtaining additional certifications in financial counseling. All activities I'd pursued quietly while my family assumed I spent my days gardening and watching television. "I want to start the consulting business we've discussed," I'd told Patricia. "I want to help other women avoid the financial vulnerabilities that made my generation dependent on family charity. I want to build something meaningful with the years I have left." "Rose," Patricia had said with obvious excitement, "you could establish a practice in any major city in the country. With your credentials, experience, and capital resources, you could create something really significant." The second call had been to Dr. Margaret Chen, my estate planning attorney. Dr. Chen had been updating my will and trust documents for 15 years, but she'd never discussed the details with my family because they'd never asked to be included in those conversations. "Margaret," I'd said, we'd been on a first-name basis for years. "I need to make some substantial changes to my estate planning. I need to completely revise the beneficiary arrangements and add some specific conditions that reflect my current understanding of family relationships." Dr. Chen had been diplomatically silent for a moment before responding. "I assume something significant has happened to change your perspective on family dynamics?" "You could say that. I've learned that my children and grandchildren see me as a burden rather than a blessing. I think my estate planning should reflect that reality." "I understand. What changes are you considering?" What I'd outlined for Dr. Chen was a complete restructuring of my will that would shock my family when they eventually discovered its contents. Instead of leaving my assets to children and grandchildren who saw me as an outdated burden, I would be establishing scholarship funds, charitable foundations, and endowments that would benefit people who actually valued education, family loyalty, and respect for elderly wisdom. Jessica and Michael would inherit my house and its contents. The physical manifestations of the life they'd decided was no longer relevant. But the financial assets they'd never known existed would go to organizations that appreciated the contributions elderly women could make to society. "Margaret, I also want to establish a foundation that provides business startup funding for women. over 60 who want to launch new careers after raising families. I want to prove that being elderly doesn't mean being useless. That's a beautiful legacy, Rose. How large an endowment are you considering? 1.5 million to start, with provisions for growth as additional assets become available. Doctor. Chen had been quiet for a long moment. Rose, your family has no idea about the scope of your financial resources, do they? None whatsoever. And I prefer to keep it that way until I'm safely established in my new life. The third call had been to Elena Morrison, my friend from the senior center who'd been trying to convince me for 3 years to partner with her in a business venture. Elena was 73, a retired executive who'd moved to Riverside Falls 5 years earlier to be closer to her daughter's family. But unlike me, Elena had maintained her independence and professional identity even after retirement. Rose, Elena had answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I was hoping you'd call tonight. I had the strangest feeling that something important was about to happen in your life. Elena, I'm ready to discuss that business partnership you've been proposing, but not here in Riverside Falls. I want to relocate completely and start fresh, somewhere new. Hallelujah! Elena had practically shouted. I've been waiting 3 years for you to realize that you're too talented and capable to waste your life being taken for granted by ungrateful family members. Elena's business proposal was ambitious and exciting. She wanted to establish a nationwide consulting firm that specialized in helping seniors transition from traditional retirement into what she called encore careers. Meaningful, profitable second acts that utilize the wisdom and experience accumulated over decades of life. The market is enormous, Rose, Elena had explained during our call. Baby boomers are living longer, staying healthier, and refusing to accept that their useful lives end at 65. But most of them don't know how to leverage their experience into new opportunities. We could build something revolutionary. Elena had already identified the perfect location for our headquarters, Sarasota, Florida, a city with a large, affluent population of active seniors who would be ideal clients for our services. She'd researched office space, staffing requirements, marketing strategies, and partnership opportunities with universities and financial institutions. With your financial planning expertise and my business development background, we could create the premier consulting firm for senior career transitions in the Southeast, Elena had said. But more importantly, we could prove that being over 70 doesn't mean being irrelevant. By the time I'd finished those 3 phone calls, I had a comprehensive plan for the next phase of my life. I would spend the next 4 months quietly, liquidating my assets, arranging my affairs, and preparing for a complete disappearance from Riverside Falls. I would relocate to Sarasota, establish a new consulting practice, and build a life that had nothing to do with being anyone's burden grandmother. But the most satisfying part of the plan was how I would handle my family's inevitable realization that I'd vanished from their lives. The next morning, I began implementing the strategy I'd developed during my sleepless hours after the phone calls. I started with small, subtle changes that wouldn't attract attention, but would prepare the groundwork for my eventual disappearance. First, I canceled all the services and subscriptions that connected me to Riverside Falls community life. The newspaper delivery, the cable television, the local gym membership, the volunteer commitments, everything that would create questions about my whereabouts when people noticed my absence. Then I began the delicate process of extracting myself from family obligations without creating suspicion. When Jessica called the Saturday after Thanksgiving to offer a stilted apology for the way the dinner conversation had gone, I was gracious and accommodating. I understand that everyone has different ideas about family traditions, I told her. I'm sorry if my attachment to the old ways made it difficult for people to express their preferences. Mom, you don't need to apologize, Jessica had said, though her tone suggested relief that I wasn't going to be difficult about the new arrangements. We just want to find ways for everyone to be comfortable and happy. Of course, dear. I think It might be good for me to step back from holiday planning and let you younger people take the lead. In fact, I'm thinking about making some changes in my life that would give me more independence and less family responsibility." "What kind of changes?" Jessica had asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice that I might be considering the senior living options Caroline had suggested. "Oh, just some lifestyle adjustments. Maybe traveling more, pursuing some interests I've put on hold while I was so focused on family obligations. Nothing dramatic, just evolution." Jessica had been delighted with this response. The idea that I might voluntarily reduce my involvement in family life was apparently exactly what she'd been hoping for, but hadn't known how to suggest. Over the next few weeks, I had similar conversations with Michael, Caroline, and even some of the grandchildren. I presented myself as someone who was gratefully accepting the family's guidance about stepping back, someone who was looking forward to a simpler, less demanding lifestyle. "I think you're making a really mature decision, Grandma," Tommy had said when I mentioned that I might not be hosting Christmas Eve dinner this year. "It's cool that you're willing to let other people take turns with the family stuff." Mature decision. Taking turns. He was treating my abdication of family leadership as personal growth rather than recognizing it as the result of being told I was a burden. But his response confirmed that my family was genuinely relieved to be free of my involvement in their celebrations. Meanwhile, I was systematically preparing for the most comprehensive disappearance any dismissed family member had ever achieved. Patricia Reynolds worked with remarkable efficiency to liquidate my investment portfolio. Within 6 weeks, she'd converted stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and real estate investments into liquid assets that could be easily transferred to new accounts in Florida. The process generated far more cash than even I had expected. My conservative investment strategies had been more successful than I'd realized. "Rose, you're looking at approximately $2.8 million in readily available assets," Patricia had told me during a meeting in early January. "Plus the equity in your house, which should add another $300,000 when you sell. You could live very comfortably for the rest of your life without ever working again, or you could fund a substantial business venture that could grow these assets even further." Dr. Chen had been equally efficient in restructuring my estate planning. The new will she'd prepared was a masterpiece of legal precision that would ensure my assets went to people and organizations that actually valued the contributions elderly women could make to society. "I've established the Rose Whitman Foundation for Senior Women's Empowerment," Dr. Chen had explained. "The foundation will provide grants for women over 60 who want to start businesses, pursue education, or launch advocacy projects. The initial endowment will be $1.5 million, with provisions for growth." "What about my children?" I'd asked, not because I'd changed my mind, but because I wanted to understand the legal implications. "Jessica and Michael will inherit your house and all personal property, including furniture, jewelry, and family mementos. They'll also receive $50,000 each, enough to demonstrate that you hadn't forgotten them, but not enough to make them financially dependent on your death." "And the grandchildren?" "Each grandchild will receive $10,000 when they turn 25, contingent on their completion of either a college degree or a professional training program. The funds will be held in trust until they meet those requirements." The beauty of this arrangement was that my family would inherit exactly what they'd valued about my life. The house where I'd hosted gatherings they no longer wanted to attend. The furniture I'd chosen for celebrations they no longer appreciated. The mementos of traditions they'd decided were outdated. The financial assets they'd never known existed would go to people who understood that elderly women could be resources, rather than burdens. Elena Morrison had been working on the Florida end of our relocation. By February, she'd secured office space in a beautiful building in downtown Sarasota, hired a small staff of professionals who specialized in senior career transitions, and developed partnerships with 3 major universities that offered continuing education programs for older adults. "Rose, you're going to love what we've created," Elena had told me during one of our weekly planning calls. We have 6,000 square feet of office space, a conference center that can accommodate workshops and seminars, and connections with every major retirement community in Southwest Florida. We'll have more potential clients than we can handle. But the most exciting part of Elena's planning was the national expansion strategy she'd developed. Once we establish our reputation in Sarasota, we can franchise the concept to other markets. Imagine consulting firms in every major metropolitan area, all focused on helping seniors transition from retirement to encore careers. We could change the entire conversation about aging in America. By March, I had received an offer on my house that exceeded my expectations. The buyers were a young family with children who were charmed by the idea of owning a home with so much family history. They had no idea that the family history they were purchasing included decades of unappreciated service, followed by a spectacular disappearance. I scheduled the closing for April 15th, exactly 4 months after the Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. The timing was perfect. Spring in Florida, the beginning of a new fiscal year for my business venture, and far enough from major holidays that my family wouldn't immediately notice my absence. The hardest part of the preparation was deciding what personal items to take with me and what to leave behind. I packed carefully, photo albums that documented my individual achievements rather than family gatherings, books that had shaped my thinking over the decades, jewelry that had personal meaning rather than family significance. Everything else, the furniture I'd chosen for hosting family celebrations, the china I'd used for holiday dinners, the decorations that had made my house feel welcoming to people who'd ultimately decided I was unwelcome, would stay with the house for the new family to enjoy. 2 weeks before my scheduled disappearance, I received a call that almost made me reconsider my plans. Sophie, Caroline's 8-year-old daughter, called me on a Tuesday evening while her parents thought she was doing homework. "Grandma Rose," she whispered into the phone, "are you okay? Mommy said you might be moving somewhere far away." My heart nearly broke hearing the worry in this child's voice. Sophie was the only family member who'd seemed genuinely distressed by my departure from Thanksgiving dinner, the only person who'd asked me to stay. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups need to make changes in their lives. But I don't want you to move away. Who's going to help me with my math homework? Who's going to make me chocolate chip cookies when I'm sad?" For a moment, I almost abandoned the entire plan. Sophie loved me genuinely, without conditions or expectations. She valued my presence in her life in ways that the adults had forgotten how to value. She didn't see me as a burden. She saw me as the grandmother who made her feel special and loved. But then I realized that Sophie's attachment to me was exactly why I needed to follow through with my plan. This beautiful child was learning from the adults in her family that elderly women's contributions were expendable, that grandmother's preferences were obstacles to overcome, that family loyalty was conditional on convenience. If I stayed and accepted the diminished role my family had assigned me, I would be teaching Sophie that it was acceptable to treat elderly women as burdens rather than blessings. "Sophie, sweetheart, I want you to remember something important," I said. "When you grow up and get old like me, don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not valuable anymore. Don't ever let anyone convince you that your ideas don't matter just because you're older. Promise me you'll remember that." "I promise, Grandma Rose, but I still want you to stay." "I know, baby. But sometimes the people we love have to make difficult decisions. Just remember that I love you very much, and that love never goes away, even when people have to be apart." After I hung up from Sophie's call, I cried for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner. Not from hurt or anger, but from grief for the relationships that could have been different if my family had chosen to value rather than dismiss me. But my grief only strengthened my resolve. I was going to prove that the woman they'd written off as a burden was actually someone remarkable. I was going to build a life that demonstrated everything they'd lost when they decided I was expendable. And someday, when they finally understood what they'd thrown away, it would be too late to repair the damage. April 15th arrived gray and drizzly, exactly like the Thanksgiving morning when my transformation had begun. I completed the house closing. At 10 a.m., signed the final papers that transferred ownership to the young family who'd fallen in love with my family home. By noon, I'd loaded my car with the few possessions I was taking to Florida, leaving behind 48 years of memories in a house that would soon be filled with someone else's dreams. Before leaving Riverside Falls, I made one final stop at the post office to mail 3 letters I'd written the night before. The first letter was addressed to Jessica and Michael together. It was brief and polite. Dear Jessica and Michael, by the time you read this, I will have relocated to begin a new chapter of my life. The house has been sold, and my affairs in Riverside Falls have been concluded. I've decided to take your advice about stepping back from family responsibilities and focusing on activities that are more age-appropriate for someone in my stage of life. Thank you for helping me understand that it was time for this transition. I wish you all the best in your future celebrations and family gatherings. Love, Mom. The second letter was addressed to Caroline, with a copy to Derek. Dear Caroline and Derek, thank you for your suggestions about senior living options and lifestyle changes appropriate for elderly women. I've decided to pursue some of those opportunities, though not in the way you might have expected. I hope you'll find that family gatherings are much more enjoyable now that you don't have to accommodate the burdensome preferences of outdated relatives. Best wishes, Rose. The third letter was addressed to my grandchildren. Dear Tommy, Emma, Jeremy, and Sophie, I want you to know that I love you all deeply, even though we may not see each other for a while. I hope that someday you'll understand that elderly people have value beyond their willingness to accommodate younger family members' preferences. I hope you'll learn to appreciate the wisdom and experience that older generations can offer, and that you'll never dismiss anyone as a burden simply because they represent traditions you don't currently appreciate. Remember that love isn't conditional. On convenience, and family loyalty shouldn't be reserved only for people whose contributions make your life easier. All my love always, Grandma Rose. I mailed the letters at 2 p.m., knowing they would be delivered the following day. By the time my family read them and realized I'd actually disappeared, I would be 500 miles away, beginning a life they'd never thought possible for the burdened grandmother they'd dismissed. The drive to Sarasota took 8 hours, through landscapes that gradually changed from the gray northeast spring to the warm palm tree-lined paradise of southwest Florida. With every mile, I felt lighter and more optimistic about the future I was creating. Elena met me at the luxury condominium complex, where I'd purchased a 2-bedroom unit with stunning views of Sarasota Bay. She'd spent the previous week furnishing the space with contemporary furniture that bore no resemblance to the traditional decor I'd left behind in Riverside Falls. Welcome to your new life, Rose Whitman, Elena said as she handed me the keys to my new home. Are you ready to show the world what a 70-year-old woman can accomplish when she stops letting other people define her limitations? I've never been more ready for anything in my life, I replied, and meant every word. The business Elena and I launched exceeded our most optimistic projections. Within 6 months, Morrison Whitman Senior Consulting had clients throughout Florida and a waiting list for our signature program, Encore Careers, transforming retirement into renaissance. We helped women launch businesses, pursue advanced degrees, start nonprofit organizations, and discover talents they'd never had time to develop while they were busy raising families and supporting other people's dreams. Our most popular workshop was called From Burden to Blessing, Reclaiming Your Value After Family Dismissal. The demand for that program was heartbreaking and inspiring. Apparently, I wasn't the only grandmother who'd been written off by family members who saw elderly women as problems to manage rather than resources to treasure. Within a year, we'd expanded to 3 offices, hired 12 consultants, and developed partnerships with major corporations that wanted to tap into the expertise of older workers. The woman my family had considered a burden was helping hundreds of other women transform from invisible elderly relatives into empowered, purposeful, financially independent individuals. But the most satisfying part of my new life was the personal transformation I experienced. I discovered interests I'd never had time to pursue, formed friendships with women who valued my intelligence and experience, and developed a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with serving other people's needs. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself rather than for my family's approval and appreciation. I also discovered that I was much more attractive and interesting than I'd realized. Within 18 months of moving to Sarasota, I was dating regularly, accomplished men who appreciated my business success, intellectual curiosity, and independence. One man in particular, Dr. James Patterson, a retired university president who volunteered with our consulting firm, became a close companion who valued my thoughts and opinions in ways my family never had. "Rose," James said one evening as we watched the sunset from my balcony, "I have to ask, didn't you have family back in New York who must miss you terribly?" "I had people who called themselves family," I replied, "but they were more interested in managing me than loving me. They saw me as a burden rather than a blessing." "Their loss," James said firmly. "You're the most vibrant, accomplished woman I've ever met. Any family would be lucky to claim you. Any family would be lucky to claim you." Words I'd never heard from the people who'd actually claimed me for 70 years. Meanwhile, back in Riverside Falls, my disappearance had created exactly the chaos I'd anticipated. Jessica had called my house the day after receiving my letter, only to discover that the number had been disconnected. Michael had driven to Maple Avenue to find strangers living in what used to be his childhood home. Caroline had contacted local hospitals and police departments, worried that I'd suffered some kind of medical emergency that had caused my confused departure. It took them 3 weeks to piece together what had actually happened. The real estate agent who'd handled my house sale finally returned Jessica's frantic calls and explained that I'd completed a planned sale that had been in process for months. The post office confirmed that I'd filed a change of address form, but the forwarding address was a P.O. box that provided no information about my actual location. Dr. Chen, bound by attorney-client privilege, could only confirm that I was alive and well, and had made my decision to relocate while of sound mind and legal capacity. Patricia Reynolds, similarly bound by professional confidentiality, confirmed that I'd liquidated my investment portfolio, but provided no details about the scope of my assets or my destination. By May, my family had hired a private investigator to track me down. By June, they'd discovered that I'd moved to Florida but couldn't pinpoint my exact location. By July, they'd learned about my business partnership with Elena Morrison and the success of our consulting firm, information that shocked them more than my disappearance itself. The grandmother they'd dismissed as a burden living on Social Security had apparently been a successful businesswoman with substantial financial resources and professional capabilities they'd never suspected. The elderly woman they'd tried to convince to move into senior living was actually living independently in a luxury condominium and running a thriving consulting practice that was being featured in national business magazines. In August, Jessica finally tracked down my business phone number and called Morrison Whitman Senior Consulting. "Morrison Whitman, this is Rose speaking. How can I help you?" I answered in my professional voice. "Mom?" Jessica's voice was small and uncertain. "Mom, is that really you?" "Hello, Jessica," I said calmly. "How did you get this number?" "We've been looking for you for 4 months. We've been worried sick. Why didn't you tell us you were moving? Why didn't you let us help you with the transition?" "Help me with the transition." She was still thinking in terms of managing my life, still assuming that my decisions required their oversight and approval. "Jessica, you made it very clear at Thanksgiving that my presence in your lives had become burdensome. I decided to relieve you of that burden. Mom, we never said you were burdensome. We just thought— Derek called me a burden, Jessica, in front of 14 family members, and nobody contradicted. Nobody defended me. Nobody suggested that maybe a man who'd known our family for 8 months wasn't qualified to characterize my value to people I'd loved and served for 50 years. The silence on Jessica's end stretched so long, I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Mom, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. We never meant for you to feel unwanted. We thought you might be happier with less responsibility. I was happiest when I felt needed and valued, Jessica. When I felt like my contributions mattered and my presence was desired rather than tolerated. But you disappeared without telling us where you were going. You sold your house without giving us a chance to say goodbye. You left us wondering if we'd ever see you again. Now you know how it feels to have someone important disappear from your life, I said quietly. The difference is, I disappeared. By choice. You made me disappear at that Thanksgiving table by deciding I was irrelevant. Mom, please tell us where you are. We want to see you. We want to make this right. I looked out my office window at the palm trees and sailboats, at the beautiful life I'd built from the ashes of their dismissal, at the proof that the woman they'd written off as a burden was actually someone remarkable. Jessica, I'm exactly where I need to be. I'm building a business that helps other women avoid the mistake I made, spending their entire lives trying to earn love and respect from people who see them as obligations rather than gifts. Are you ever coming home? Jessica asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. I am home, Jessica. For the first time in my adult life, I'm home. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a few minutes, processing the conversation and the emotions it had stirred up. I felt sadness for the relationships that might have been different, but I also felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months later, I received a letter from Sophie, now 9 years old and apparently learning to write more sophisticated letters. Dear Grandma Rose, Mommy gave me your address and said I could write to you. I miss you very much. I wish you would come visit us, but Daddy says you're probably too busy with your important job to come back to Riverside Falls. I want you to know that I remember what you told me about not letting people say I'm not valuable. When I get old, I told my teacher about you, and she said you sound like a very brave lady who followed her dreams. I hope you're happy in Florida. I hope someday I can visit you and see the ocean. Love, Sophie P.S. I still make chocolate chip cookies sometimes and think about you. I framed Sophie's letter and put it on my desk, next to a photo of Elena and me receiving a state award for our contributions to senior empowerment. It reminded me every day that my decision to disappear hadn't just changed my life. It had also planted seeds in the mind of a young girl who would someday understand that elderly women deserve respect rather than dismissal. 2 years after my disappearance, my family finally learned the full scope of what they'd lost when they decided I was a burden. Dr. Chen contacted them to discuss some estate planning updates, and in the course of that conversation, they discovered the extent of my financial resources and the fact that their inheritance had been dramatically reduced in favor of charitable organizations. Your mother was a woman of substantial means, Dr. Chen had explained to Jessica and Michael. The Rose Whitman Foundation for Senior Women's Empowerment will be funding business startups and educational opportunities for elderly women throughout the region. She wanted to ensure that her resources went to people who appreciated the contributions older women could make to society. Jessica had called me after that meeting, sobbing into the phone. Mom, we had no idea. We never knew you had that kind of money. We never knew you were so accomplished. Why didn't you tell us? Would it have mattered, Jessica? I asked. Would you have treated me differently if you'd known I was wealthy? Would Derek have been less likely to call me a burden if he'd known I was worth $3 million? I don't know. Maybe. But we could have helped you invest it or— Jessica, I didn't need help investing it. I'd been successfully managing my financial affairs for 50 years, while you all assumed I was helplessly living on Social Security. I built that wealth myself, through careful planning and smart decisions that none of you ever bothered to ask about. We just thought, you assumed that because I was elderly and had worked as a school secretary, I must be financially incompetent. You assumed that because I lived modestly, I must be struggling. You assumed that because I focused on family rather than displaying wealth, I must not have any. The conversation continued for an hour, with Jessica alternating between apologies and attempts to convince me to reconsider my estate planning decisions, but I'd made peace with my choices. My resources would go to people who understood that elderly women could be assets rather than liabilities, contributors rather than burdens. Today, 3 years after my dramatic disappearance from Riverside Falls, I'm 73 years old and living my best life. Morrison Whitman Senior Consulting has offices in 12 cities and has helped over 3,000 women transition from traditional retirement to meaningful encore careers. I travel frequently for speaking engagements, serve on the boards of several national organizations focused on aging issues, and maintain an active social life with people who value my intelligence and experience. My relationship with James Patterson has deepened into something beautiful and mature, a partnership between equals who respect and support each other's independence and accomplishments. We're planning a trip to Europe next spring, something I never thought I'd be able to afford or enjoy. My health is excellent, my finances are more secure than ever, and my sense of purpose has never been stronger. I wake up every morning excited about the day ahead, grateful for the second chance I created for myself, and proud of the woman I became when I stopped trying to earn other people's approval. My family occasionally sends cards and letters, always with invitations to visit or requests for reconciliation. Jessica has apologized repeatedly, Michael has acknowledged that they misunderstood my capabilities, and even Derek has sent a letter admitting that he was wrong to characterize me as a burden. But some damage can't be undone with apologies. Some relationships can't be rebuilt once the foundation of respect has been destroyed. They had 50 years to know me, value me, and treat me with dignity. They chose instead to see me as an obligation that became increasingly burdensome as I aged. The woman they dismissed as a burden has become someone they could never have imagined. The grandmother they tried to manage into irrelevance has built a life that proves everything they thought they knew about elderly women was wrong. I don't hate them. I don't wish them harm. But I also don't need their approval or validation anymore. I've learned that respect can't be earned through service, that dignity can't be purchased with devotion, and that sometimes the only way to teach people your worth is to show them the cost of losing you. If someone in your life is treating you like you don't matter, maybe it's time to show them exactly how much you do. Maybe it's time to stop being grateful for scraps and start demanding the feast you've earned. Maybe it's time to stop accepting diminished roles and start creating the life you actually deserve. Because you're never too old, never too late, never too dismissed to rewrite your story. Sometimes you just need the right motivation to begin. And sometimes, the best revenge is a life so beautiful and successful that the people who hurt you finally understand what they lost. But only after it's too late to get it back. What's your story? Share it in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your worst day into your biggest victory. You're never just a burden. You're never just an obligation. You're a person with value, dignity, and unlimited potential for creating something amazing. The question is, what are you going to do with that potential? The transformation starts now. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.